Hi. We're going to take a look today at two pawn positions, and they can be broken down into two types. Those positions in which one player is up two pawns, and those in which the players have a pawn each. And we're going to look first at the two pawn up positions because I think they're easier to understand, especially when you're armed with a particular strategic rule, which is that while a one pawn advantage in an endgame tends to give its owner significant winning chances, there are also all sorts of positions in which the defender can draw. Whereas a two-pawn advantage, and of course here we're talking about a literal two-pawn advantage, not the advantage of an exchange, is almost always winning for its owner. Okay, so armed with that rule, you should have an easy time evaluating the first few positions we're going to look at. But I thought I would show you some important ideas. They're very basic, but they're important so that we can be as complete as possible. All right, in the position we're looking at now, white has two extra pawns and is therefore very likely to be winning according to the rule I just gave you. And in fact, white is winning here. But I wanted to show you what it looks like when the pawns are on neighboring files, in this case d5, the d file and the e file. White has pawns on d5 and e4. Because these pawns protect each other very easily. Even if it's black's turn to move here, black can play king to e5, intending to capture the white pawn on e4, and white might be a little bit dismayed at the fact that he can't immediately defend his pawns with his king. But it doesn't matter, because if black ever takes this pawn on e4, white plays d6, and the black king can't catch up to white's d-pawn, so white makes a new queen and wins. That's simple enough. But what about when the pawns are separated by a file, as in this position? Can they still protect each other? Or will black gobble them up before the white king gets close enough to protect them? Black can play king to e5, threatening this pawn on e4. And now if white plays king to g2, black takes the pawn on e4 and is close enough to the pawn on c4 that it will not be able to queen. Black will successfully capture it. For example, c5, king d5, c6, king takes c6. So is that the verdict? Is this a draw? Actually, it's not, because the white pawns, even when they're separated by a file, can defend each other. After king to e5, white can play the move c5, creating a wall of squares that are protected by the white pawns. And now that the c-file pawn is one rank ahead of the e-file pawn, if black takes the pawn on e4, white plays c6 and can't be stopped from making a new queen. So after c5, black's only choice is to retreat with his king and try to stop the c-pawn from queening. But he can't directly go back to d6 because it's guarded by a pawn, as is the d5 square, so he has to go to e6. And now white has a chance to bring his king closer. Black can try to come around and win the c-pawn with king d7. But now white can play e5, and black is faced with the same problem he had a moment ago. When he approaches one of the pawns, the other one advances, creating a wall. And there's nothing the black king can do about that except try to go back around, but white will level the pawns again, and as soon as black attacks one of them, white will create a wall by advancing the other one, and eventually one of them will queen. By the way, a note about these endgames. The reason that black is trying to win the two white pawns quickly is that the alternative is that the white king has enough time to approach his pawns and protect them. And if the white king can escort his pawns up the board, he'll win without a contest. Okay, when there are two or more files between the pawns, it's typically very easily winning for the side with the pawns. Usually because the defender can't capture one of the pawns without being too far away from the other one to stop it from queening. But I thought I'd show you one exception. In this position, white's pawns have two files between them, and it's black to move, and this position is a draw. Go ahead and pause the video and see if you can figure out why if you want to. Otherwise, I'll just show you. Black can play the move king h5, attacking the pawn on h4. And now if white moves his king, of course, as in the other example, black will just take the pawn on h4, and is close enough to the pawn on e4 to stop it from queening. e5, king g5, e6, king f6, e7, king takes e7. So after king h5, white should play the move e5, making it so that if black takes the pawn on h4, white will play e6 and win the game. But here black has the move king to g6, threatening to come around and grab the e-pawn instead. And unfortunately, unlike in that situation in which there was one file between the pawns, here the pawns can't level themselves out. If white plays h5, black simply takes the pawn and is close enough to the e-pawn to stop it from queening. And if white advances his e-pawn again, then after king f6, black has time to gobble up the e-pawn and get back in time to stop the h-pawn. h5, king takes e6, h6, king f6, and black will successfully stop white's h-pawn. So white has left at his disposal only one more thing to do, and that's king g2. And now black can go after this e-pawn, and again, if white advances his h-pawn, black gobbles up the e-pawn and is in time to stop the pawn on h5. And after e6, of course, black can take that pawn and is able to stop the h-pawn because it's a rook pawn, at the very least, which means he can just run to the corner and dance in and out of the corner and draw the game. So white can try advancing with his king instead, king g3. Black gobbles up the pawn on e5, king takes e5, king g4, king f6, king h5, and while black does not successfully take the opposition in front of white's pawn, luckily for him, white's pawn is a rook pawn, which means all that black has to do is get to the corner, and the game's going to be a draw. So this position with black to move is a draw. But to show you just how winning two pawn-up positions typically are, I created a position in which black's king is one file over. The king's on f6 instead of g6. And this is enough to make this position winning for white. If you use the same technique for black, king e5, white plays h5, and then you come back with the king, king f6. White can move up with his king, king g2, and then after king g5, king f3, king takes h5, king f4, king g6, king to e5. Black is not able to step on the e7 square immediately, which is what's necessary for him to draw the game. He can play king f7, but after king d6, king e8, king e6, king d8, e5, white has his pawn on the 5th rank, his non-rook pawn on the 5th rank, and his king on the square in front of it, which means that the position is winning for white regardless of the position of the black king and regardless of whose turn it is to move. Here comes one of my cats. So these two pawn-up endgame positions are very winning for the side with the two pawns. That's why I usually recommend to people that in a middle game, if you're up one pawn, you treat it as if you're up nothing. While if you're up two pawns, you strongly consider trading a bunch of pieces and heading for an endgame. Okay, so with these two pawn-up positions out of the way, let's move over to talking about positions in which the players have a pawn each. And those positions can be further broken down into two types. Positions in which the pawns are not able to stop each other, meaning they're far enough apart from each other that they're not going to make contact, and positions in which they are going to make contact. In the former case, you have what might be called a race situation, with both players trying to create new queens. And the evaluation of those positions depends upon who's going to create a queen first, and upon the creation of that queen, whether or not the position is winning for that player. And in order to figure that out, you have to know about something called queen versus pawn on the 7th endgame theory, which I'll be addressing in a future video. So what we're going to look at today are positions in which the pawns do make contact with each other. And I think the best way to understand those positions is to look in particular at positions in which the two pawns are locked together on the same file. In this position, white has a pawn on d4, and black has a pawn on d5. The pawns are locked together, And it looks like a pretty simple position. And the question is, what's going on here? Does one player have an advantage? Is it just an easy draw? And it turns out that, and I promise this is the last time, these positions again can be broken down into two types. Positions in which, she's just going to interrupt everything today, I guess. Positions in which the one player's king is defending his pawn and the other person's king is attacking, is sort of trying to make progress toward the defender's pawn. And positions in which the two players' kings are both going after the other guy's pawn. So let's look first at this type of position in which there's a king on defense. When this is the case, the attacker, if he can reach any of, let's get rid of these circles, any of the three squares horizontally adjacent to the defender's pawn on either side, wins the defender's pawn by force. And that's because as he tries to make progress toward the defender's pawn, on each file he has two squares on which he can place his king. Whereas the defender's king, in his quest to stop the attacker from making any progress, only has one square on each file. He only has e6. He doesn't have e5 because it's protected by a white pawn. He only has d6. He doesn't have d5 because it's occupied by his pawn. And he has c6, but he doesn't have c5 because it's protected by a white pawn. So, each step of the way, if white needs to, he can waste a move, and black is forced to cede ground. For example, king g6. Black is forced to make a move. He can't play king e5, which he'd like to because it's protected by a white pawn. So black has to allow white to make progress toward his pawn. King f5, king d6. Okay, says black, I've stopped you from making progress. But the problem is that white again can waste a move. King f6, king d7, king e5, king c6, and black says, okay, now I've stopped you. But the problem is that white once again has another square. White can play king e6, black can't move his king to c5, which means black must abandon at this point the defense of his pawn. King c7, king takes d5. So white has won black's pawn by force, but that does not necessarily mean that white is winning the game. And in order to figure out whether or not white is winning the game, you need knowledge of single pawn endgames. And for a refresher on that, see my earlier video. In this position, black draws with the move king d7. So again, if the attacker's king can reach any of the three squares horizontally adjacent to the defender's pawn, and if the defender's king is on defense, and by that I mean he's trying to defend his pawn rather than come around and counterattack the white pawn, the attacker wins the defender's pawn by force, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's winning the game. Okay, let's take a look at what happens when both kings attack the other guy's pawn. It results in a type of position known as a trebuchet, which looks like this. And what's very interesting about this position is that whoever has to move loses the game. White's king's on e5, but if it's white's turn to move, there's nowhere he can move his king to from which he continues to defend his pawn on d4. He can't come to the e4 square because it's guarded by a black pawn. He can't capture the pawn on d5 because it's guarded by the black king, so he has to abandon the defense of his pawn. King f4, and once he does that, black captures the white pawn, and it's necessarily the case, because of the nature of the type of position we started with, that white cannot now play king d2, which is what would be necessary to draw the game. And the same is true if it's black's turn to move. If black had to move his king away, white would capture the black pawn, and black would not be able to play king to d7, which is the move black has to be able to play in order to draw. So a trebuchet is winning for the side whose turn it is not to move. It's very interesting for that reason. Okay, armed with that knowledge, and with the knowledge of the fact that when one person's king is on defense, you can win his pawn by force if you can reach one of the three squares horizontally adjacent to his pawn. Let's take a look at this position. It's very similar to one we just looked at, What's the difference? The difference is that the two pawns are on different ranks. Here, white has a pawn on d4, and black has a pawn on d5, while here, white has a pawn on d5, and black has a pawn on d6. What difference does that make? Well, it turns out it makes all the difference in the world, because now, when white wins black's pawn, which will happen by force because he's reached one of the 3 squares horizontally adjacent to that pawn on either side, with the defender's king on defense, white will have a pawn on the 5th rank, and his king on the 6th rank right in front of it, and the pawn is a non-rook pawn, which means white is winning at that point regardless of whose turn it is to move, and regardless of the position of the black king. For example, king g7, king e8, white makes progress, king f6, king d7, black stops white, but it's very temporary because white can waste a move and black can't. King f7, king d8, king e6, king c7, king e7. Black must now abandon the defense of his pawn, king c8, king takes d6, and even though black can take the opposition here, the fact that white's pawn is a non-rook pawn and is on the 5th rank means it's winning for white. For example, king to e6, king e8, d6, king d8, d7, and black has no choice but to play king c7, allowing king to e7, which will force the queening of the white pawn. Okay, so now it's time to put all of that together and give you this position. Again, we have locked pawns on the d-file. White is a pawn on d5, and black is a pawn on d6. And the question is, what's the evaluation of this position? It's white to move, and the answer takes into account everything we've looked at so far. White can play the move king to f5. Now, we understand already that if white tries to defend his pawn passively with king to e4, black can put his king on offense with king b6, king d4, king b5, and black has occupied one of the 3 squares horizontally adjacent to the white pawn with white's king on defense, which means black will win white's pawn by force, but in this case black's pawn is only on the 3rd rank from his point of view, which means that with proper play from white the result will be a draw. For example, king d3, king c5, king e4, king c4, king e3, king takes d5, and white's in time to play king d3, taking the opposition in front of a pawn that's not on the 5th rank, which means white will draw. But white can try for more than that. He can try attacking the black pawn, king to f5. What should black do? Well, black has 2 options. One is to passively defend his pawn, and if you remember the positions we've looked at recently, you'll realize that the result of that will be that white will win the black pawn by force, and that when he does so, the fact that he has a 5th rank pawn means that he's winning no matter where the black king is and no matter whose turn it is to move. For example, king c7, king to e6, king c8, king takes d6, king d8, and white wins. Black's other option is to counterattack with king to b6, saying to white, you're going to go after my pawn on d6, and I'm going to go after your pawn on d5, and we'll see what happens. Okay, so a terrible blunder here for white would be the move king to e6, which is a very natural move. Because it allows black to play king c5, establishing a trebuchet with white to move, which means white is losing. For example, king to f5, king takes d5, king f4. The only way that white would have drawn this position is if he could have played king d3 immediately. So after king f5, king b6, white should not step on the e6 square. He wants black to step on the c5 square first, and then he steps on e6 and wins with the better side of a trebuchet. So the right move here for white is king to f6. Now black can make a terrible mistake with king c5, allowing white to establish a winning trebuchet. So black, and again if black's king goes on defense with king c7, white's already occupying one of the 3 critical squares horizontally adjacent to the black pawn. White will win that pawn by force and end the game. So black can try king b5, basically copying white and saying, I'm not going to get in a bad trebuchet, I'm going to try to get you to step into one. And white again can make a terrible blunder with king e6, and after king c5, black is winning the game. But white can play the move king to e7, attacking the black pawn on d6, saying to black, if you don't defend this pawn, I'm going to take it, and then the fact that I have a pawn on d5 with my king in front of it means I'm winning. So black does not have time to play king c4. He would just lose his pawn on d6. He has to defend his pawn with king to c5. But now white has successfully gotten black to step on the c5 square before he steps on the e6 square. White goes king e6 and has the winning side of a trebuchet. For example, king b6, king takes d6, and white wins. So this stuff is starting to get more complex. You can see that going from one pawn to two pawns ramps up the complexity of the position significantly. And we're only looking at a subset of a subset of the openings that you can get when there are two pawns on the board. Let's take a look at one more thing, and I'm going to leave this with you as a puzzle. This position is black to play, and the question is, what's the evaluation and why? And again, finding the answer will require everything we've looked at so far. Okay, so that's positions in which the players have one pawn each, and those pawns are locked with each other. And I think you can use this endgame theory to understand many endgames of this type. As I said before, in the future I will go over queen versus pawn on the 7th, which will help you understand race situations. But for now, I'll leave you with this problem. It's black to play. What's the evaluation? And what's black's best move? Let me know in the comments what you think. Okay,